When I say artist, where does your mind go? What words or images pop into your mind? Van Gogh, Da Vinci, Mozart. What about when I say scientist? Einstein, Newton, a nerdy boy in goggles and a lab coat. Now, at any point in those last 15 seconds or so, did the same word ever pop into your mind more than once? A word perhaps that you associated with artist. Did you also happen to associate it with scientist? I'd now like to ask you, why do you think the answer to that question is no for the majority of the people in this room? Well, this is what I'd like to talk to you about today: art and science. Notice how there's an and between the two, as if they are separate entities. Well, they are. We differentiate them in school and in our careers, occasionally even value one over the other. But what if I were to tell you that the two of them are actually very closely related? As a young science student frequently seeking involvement in the scientific community, I'm often asked to talk about myself and describe where I'd like to be in the future, establish my goals and my passions and ambitions. Well, I usually start with saying, well, I'm a science student. I study microbiology and infectious diseases. I talk about how I really enjoy what I'm studying, and although I find it challenging, I very rarely find myself bored. I'm then commonly asked, well, what do you like to do as a hobby? Well, I love art, I say. And this is where I notice some eyes begin to fall, and it's usually up to me to try and find a way to continue the conversation, since I no longer seem to hold much value to the academic questioning me. Few people in the scientific community seem to share my belief that a passion for the arts serves as a powerful complement to proficiency in the sciences. Perhaps there are even members of the audience today who feel this way. Well, over the next few minutes, I'm going to make it my goal to try and show you why I feel the arts must live alongside the sciences in order for progress and innovation to occur. Now, let me show you how. Let's start by setting a framework for what I really mean when I say art and when I say science. Now, over the past number of years, I've asked countless people around me to tell me what they feel really defines art and what defines science. I've summarized some of the most common terms that I heard here. Now, taking these terms into consideration, we can create a loose understanding of art by saying it's a way through which we observe our surroundings, and through a filter of emotion, imagination, and design, we create narrative, expression, and beauty. Similarly, science is rooted in the notion of observation, and through the means of research, experimentation, and data analysis, we create theory, knowledge, and potentially even fact. As is clear, both art and science are already rooted in the fact that we begin with the notion of observation. But how else are these two fields interrelated? Well, let us think back to the early days of scientific discovery, and I mean very early days, when the power of the internet wasn't available for us to spread our ideas so rapidly and so widely. Hence, much attention and care were given to the art of communication. Now, what you're seeing here is an image of, perceivably, one of the most oldest forms of scientific writing. Now, it's believed to have been written in the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago, and it's thought to depict some of the astronomical patterns observed in the night sky at the time. Similarly, the image on the right shows one of the first forms of ancient Egyptian geometry, believed to have been used in the process of building the pyramids. And of course, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this image here. It's Leonardo da Vinci's portrayal of the anatomy in the human arm. I invite you to think about what marries these three images together. Sure, they all depict some pivotal moment in the progress of scientific history, but what's pivotal to point out is that each and every one of them was created and still exists today due to an astounding ability to communicate through the means of visual art. But surely not all art is visual, and imagery is not the only means through which art can provide a form of communication. Whether it's the way a ballet dancer curves and mosaics her long, lustrous limbs, or the wave we observe in a musician's body as they're willed to move like an extension of their instrument. The power and complexity of narrative a single photograph can provide, or the depth of life's most potent questions summarized in a single page through the means of a poem. Art is inherently an act of communication. Take poetry, for example. A poet's main goal is to convey some driving message to an audience, all in the span of very few words. Poetry takes on a rather structured and concise approach. This is what makes it so effective, how much it says with so little substance. Well, science is likewise a means of communication. And this brings us to our first pillar of artistry in scientific innovation, that being, of course, communication. You see, art is a kaleidoscope, a diverse medium through which we can communicate our message. And through this diverse medium, art provides us with the tools necessary to render our message that we derive in science more accessible and more universal. So now that we've established the importance of communication as it pertains to scientific inquiry, let us look at yet another pillar of artistry in scientific innovation. Now, what you're seeing here is an image of some blood vessels, probably something that multiple doctors and biologists would be fairly familiar with. Contrarily, here we have a drawing of a tree, something that multiple landscape artists would probably be deeply familiar with. It's not hard to notice that the two share an uncanny resemblance. But I invite you to think about what kind of skills are necessary for our landscape artist here to create such an image. I'm sure we'd all agree that perception to detail, attention to every twig, every branch, every shadow is key. But can't we say the same thing about our doctor analyzing our blood vessels? The skill that unites these two concepts together is that of perception. Now, perception has actually been discussed in the context of art and science in the past. Well-known lawyer and art historian Amy Herman put together an entire seminar series in the year 2000 entitled The Art of Perception in order to aid medical students in improving their observation skills. Her point was to say, through the use of various forms of art, sculpture, visual art, she wanted to point out that observing presence is just as important as observing absence. Take this picture here, for example. Now, this is a painting by René Magritte. Now, Herman brings this forth, and she asks the audience how they would go about describing it. Well, the majority of audience members say, well, there's a train coming out of the fireplace, some candlesticks, a clock, and a mirror. But a small portion of audience members replied with something along the lines of, well, there's a train with no tracks, an empty fireplace, and no candles in the candlesticks. Which description do you deem more accurate? According to Herman, the idea that renders the second description stronger is that it not only pays attention to that which we are able of seeing and observing, but also that which we are not able of seeing and observing. How do we do this exactly? Well, we cultivate perception. Perception is, by definition, the skills through which we perceive detail, the skills through which we pay attention to what we must pay attention to in the first place. And art is fundamentally a beautiful means through which we can develop and implement our skills of perception to then use them to improve the accuracy and the skills involved to perform strong and impressionable science. Now, there's a word I've been avoiding throughout the duration of this talk, mostly because it seems to have lost quite a lot of its meaning. But it's important to say that it is probably the most important skill that someone can develop through the form of art making and implement in their science. And that is creativity, of course. Now, let's take a look at these images here, these photographs, or as they're called, Chrono Photographs by the French physiologist Étienne Jules Marey. Now, Marais was fascinated by the way through which the human body moved, the ways that our bones and our muscles work together in a series of mechanical levers and fulcrums. But given that he was working on the tail end of the 19th century, he couldn't exactly resort to video as a means of research. Similarly, observing his colleagues walk back and forth in his studio really wasn't proving to be a valuable use of his time, nor that of his colleagues. But Marais was also a really avid photographer and quite the creative himself. And so he thought, could I work with the camera somehow to prolong its exposure and capture multiple unique photos within one frame? Well, as you can see, the answer was clearly yes. In fact, owing to Marais' chrono photography, milestones were achieved in bodily kinetics and musculoskeletal physiology way ahead of its time. So this brings us to our third and final pillar of artistry as it pertains to scientific innovation: creativity. See, science is complex and oftentimes difficult to grasp. It is a scientist's job to bring their knowledge and the intangible world of their laboratory into our world, convey it into something meaningful, something physical, something that might just better humankind and life and our universe itself. Similarly, it is an artist's job to take the intangible world they see within their minds and convert it into a physical form of art through whatever medium that may be. Creativity bridges the gap between art and science, allowing human beings to think outside the box. Imagination, innovation, and novel approaches to life's greatest questions lie at the very core of creativity itself. Have I convinced you yet that art and science work together rather harmoniously? So then why do we make such a distinction between the two? Speaking from the perspective of a science student and an aspiring problem solver, if we imagine the solution to a problem as a very distinct color, let it be a mix of different colors. Well, we can combine the brightest, boldest, and sharpest of reds, these being our great scientists, our critical thinkers, our rigorous minds. But we might not ever reach our solution because we need a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow, maybe even a little bit of gray. And these are the painters, the poets, the sculptors, the storytellers, the dreamers, the artists. Progress in life's greatest questions depends not only on knowing, but on communicating, on perceiving, and on creating. Progress in answering science's greatest questions depends on artistic insight. And so let me tell you this. If you've ever been told that your mind doesn't belong in a particular environment, strive to prove why that might not necessarily be the case. Strive to show that any problem, any issue, in any profession can and should be approached through the means of multiple intelligences. So that the next time you hear the word scientist, maybe you will still end up seeing that nerdy boy in goggles and lab coat. But maybe this time he'll be holding a paintbrush or dancing to Mozart. And I bet you he'll have a pretty big smile on his face too. Thank you.